Gilbert Holden of Intake Farm. The summer of 1809 was warm and pleasant in the hills around Lobden above Whitworth. At Hodge Hill on the western slopes of Brown Wardle there stood Intake Farm. Also known as Intac, which is Old Norse for enclosure, it was a weathered stone house built in 1680 by James and Mary Clegg of Tong End, with thick grey walls and windows that stared blankly over the fields towards St Bartholomew's. This was the home of Gilbert Holden, a young labourer who was the son of a well-respected farmer. He was aged 27 and lived here with his wife and infant child. Life was hard. The fields yielded little, the work was endless, and coin was scarcer than kindness in the wind-swept hills. Desperation in times like these can make men bold, reckless, or both. Gilbert, along with a few companions, frustrated by their ongoing hardships, hatched a plan to buy based sovereigns and forged banknotes from a supplier in Birmingham. They would then go on to use them at various markets and fairs across Rochdale and the neighbouring towns. At first, it seemed a fairly harmless scheme of necessity and a chance to breathe above the suffocating weight of poverty. But soon the circulating forged currency began turning up far and wide, eventually drawing in the attention of the law. John Naden, known for being a terrible man with a terrible name, was a sharp-eyed constable from Manchester. He suspected a gang of counterfeiters was at work in the area, and so enlisted 2 bounty hunters to seek them out whilst he concentrated on affairs within the city. James Whitehead, also known as James of Peters, the owner of the Flying Horse Inn in Rochdale, and J. Shaw of Smallbridge, a respected manufacturer and a man whose cunning was rivalled only by his ambition, were hired for the job with the promise of a handsome reward for bringing the culprits to justice as soon as possible, preferably for the upcoming assizes at Lancaster, which was scheduled for August. Assizes, or courts of assize, were historical courts in England and Wales, which held sessions in county towns twice a year to try serious criminal cases and civil matters, presided over by visiting judges who lodged nearby. The 2 men followed trails of gossip and shadow, compiling bits and pieces of truth gathered from around the slums and pubs of Rochdale, until finally a breakthrough. They'd struck up a conversation at Rochdale Market with Lawrence Law, who was working on his stall selling pots and earthenware. Gilbert Holden, according to Lawrence, could get hold of the notes that Whitehead and Shaw were asking after, and a meeting was quickly arranged. It wasn't long until the devious pair had their suspected counterfeiters, and 4 men were implicated. A messenger was dispatched who sped to Manchester, summoning Naden to meet with Whitehead and Shaw without delay. That hazy summer evening, as the sun bled red behind the South Pennine Hills, Naden and his officers rode hard and fast through Whitworth Valley. Boots struck sparks from the stones, spurs glimmered, dust clouds billowed behind them, and the air itself seemed to shiver with the sense of impending doom. They ascended Limer's Gate, their eyes fixed on Intake Farm. Inside, unaware, Gilbert was tending to his family when the law loudly broke through the threshold. In the soft glow of the dying evening light, he was seized. His wife clutched their child in horror, the screams echoing through the moorland. Elsewhere, 3 accomplices were also captured. James Cudworth of Lobden, James Draper of Whitworth, and Lawrence Lawley of Millgate were all arrested. Another man, Thomas Howarth of Hades Hill in the Watergrove Valley, vanished into the shadows. Hiding in the thick rushes of the moors, he was aided with blankets and food by relatives for several weeks before eventually fleeing to another part of the country. At the assizes in Lancaster on the 14th of August 1809, Gilbert faced charges of uttering, the act of knowingly passing or circulating forged banknotes. The crime was essentially orchestrated by Whitehead and Shaw, who suspected him to be a main dealer of counterfeit currency. After their conversation in Rochdale Market, Lawrence Law had put Whitehead in touch with Gilbert, who had then sold 4 notes to him at their meeting valuing £2 each for 26 shillings. And Mr. Yates, who was defending Holden, argued that he had merely procured the notes rather than physically manufacture them, and that it was entrapment. The judge, the Honourable Sir Owen Schamborough, and his Georgian colleagues deliberated for 3 long months, probably due to a lack of any real evidence, whilst the men rotted in the horrific conditions of Lancaster jail. Meanwhile, the poor families suffered on the outside, waiting for the sentence. Eventually, on the 11th of November, a decision was made. Although the evidence against the other men was more conclusive, the jury still found all 4 guilty. The judges decided that there was no smoke without fire, and the verdict handed out was death. And so it was on the grey morning of the 25th of November 1809. The terrified men were escorted from their squalid cells at Lancaster jail to Hanging Corner via the French window which led out onto the creaking scaffold. 2 more men convicted of similar crimes also met their end that day, James Smith from Manchester and Robert Hartley from Rochdale. Onlookers commented on how the condemned were already as pallid as death as they shuffled out into the cold morning air. They were all hanged using the agonising short drop method in front of a gawking crowd, where death is caused by a slow strangulation rather than a quick neck break obtained by the later practice of the long drop. Consciousness was usually lost within 6 to 10 seconds, with the condemned frequently not meeting their demise for up to 20 minutes. Bodies were sometimes left hanging for up to an hour to make sure the job was done. James Draper and James Smith were interred at Bolton, James Cudworth at Whitworth, whilst Lawrence Law and Robert Hartley were buried at St Chad's in Rochdale. Gilbert's body was returned to his distraught father that same day in a cheap, crude casket, the hangman's noose still gripping tightly round his neck, a grim and cruel reminder of a life ended too soon. He was quickly buried in Holfull Chapel's old graveyard by moonlight. The small stone chapel which stood in Gilbert's time was built around 1716 when the area was known as Miltstone Gap, and stood at the junction of what is now Wallbank Drive and Hall Street. It was demolished in 1849. His simple gravestone would eventually vanish into time, leaving only whispers, memory, and stories passed down through generations amongst the people of Whitworth. The land where the cemetery once stood, opposite the chapel's original location, is now a green space, a place where people walk and children play, unaware of the many spent lives that rest beneath their feet. It's said that immense numbers of people turned out to witness the men's interments and expressed a great deal of sorrow for their unfortunate ends. And whilst the distraught families of the men mourn the loss of their sons, Whitehead and Shaw, now enriched with their bounty, became figures of public contempt in Rochdale. Whitehead bought 3 stone houses on Milnery Road near the now-gone Fox Inn with his blood money, forever referred to by the people of the town as Hangman's Row. Shaw attempted to win back favour through charity, giving to the poor and selling cheap oatmeal on the market, but few accepted the cruel hand that dealt such tainted coins, with the bulk of his oats ending up as pig feed. John Naden, the sharp-eyed constable from Manchester, retired to Cheshire and lived out his days. Targeted by the criminal community, he suffered theft after theft of poultry and horses as payback for his part in the death of the young men. Despite his unjust and premature death, Intake Farm did not release Gilbert. The old building soon gained the reputation as the most haunted house in Whitworth. They still say that on dark nights when the wind moans through the hollows, a shadow lingers on Hodge Hill. One tenant of the farm, decades after Gilbert's death, swore he saw a figure standing at the field's edge, staring toward Rochdale as though pleading for a life stolen too soon. A forlorn spectre was clearly seen within its walls one morning by a man named Mr. Rigg and his mother as they had breakfast. Frequently, footsteps were heard upstairs, door latches opened by themselves, and a child's cry echoed through empty rooms, a cry that came from no living being. A hiker, exploring the rotting beams at dusk, felt a sudden chill brush his neck and a whisper, soft, mournful and unmistakable, "Gilbert." Intake's shell stood roofless and derelict for many years. By 1970, the old house was gone, reduced to a heap of rubble, silent now but for the whispers of the breeze licking their way around the stones. Yet, on nights when the air is thick and still, when the moon casts a pale eye over Hodge Hill, some claim the mournful figure of Gilbert Holden walks once more, searching for the family he lost and for the life that Whitehead and Shaw stole from him.